I'm Blake Tyers of Creature Comforts Brewing Company, and this is the Brewer to Brewer podcast from All About Beer. My guest is Brad Clark of Private Press Brewery, and he is here for a conversation that goes beyond the brew house and into topics that matter to brewing professionals and curious beer drinkers. First, please visit allaboutbeer.com and follow on social media at allaboutbeer. And to support journalism in the beer space, check out patreon.com/allaboutbeer. We'll get into the conversation in just a moment, but first, this message.
First Tee is a proud sponsor of the Brewer to Brewer podcast. Some of the brightest brewers across the country have discovered the First Tee advantage. Hill Farmstead, Sweetwater Brewing Company, and Angry Chair are among the many who have used First Tee's unique and quality teas and botanicals to create top-rate beers. First Tee focuses on being direct, flexible, and fast. You can find out more about First Tee's collaboration with brewers and tea ingredients by visiting firsttee.com/blog. That's FIRSDTEA.com/blog.
Okay, let's get into it. A bit about my guest today. Brad Clark is the founder and operator of Private Press Brewing, located in Santa Cruz, California. Clark has specialized in creating barrel-aged malt-forward beers for almost 2 decades and is now focused exclusively on composing imperial stouts and barley wines. Private Press is a dedicated pursuit to craft the beers that Clark loves and admires without compromise. Brad, it's good to see you, my friend.
Good to see you too.
Thanks for jumping on this podcast, and I'm really excited to talk to you today.
Yeah, thank you for reaching out to me and making all this happen. It's great to see you, Blake. It's been too long.
It has, and it was a fun opportunity. You know, I got to pick what brewer I wanted to talk to, and basically, I was just like, well, what conversation do I want to have with a friend of mine? And I hadn't caught up with you in a while. Hadn't really talked in depth since you started at Private Press. It's always been in passing, so I'm really excited to kind of ask you how that's going. And so I guess we'll just get right into it. So it's been fun watching you put this whole thing together. I've been a member, and I thank you for letting me be a part of it. I've been really enjoying see how you construct this new creation and make it yours. And it's definitely a different brewery than you were doing before, and it's a different brewery than most are doing still. So I think once you dig into that, though, the really cool thing that strikes me is your passion for music. You've got records and speakers and a turntable behind you. You know, it's right there. So I think, it's pretty obvious that the influence that has had on this project. So I want to start there. Tell me about your relationship with music. How did it begin? And, what got you into music to be as a part of your life as it is today?
Yeah, great question. It started when I was young. My dad was really into like smooth jazz, or 80s jazz, and always had like a lot of CDs, and was always, there's always music playing in the house. And so I think I just kind of like latched onto that very early on. My parents tell me stories of like when I couldn't sleep, they'd go downstairs and turn on like MTV, and that would put me to sleep. So yeah, as soon as I could start buying music or started having an allowance, I was buying cassettes and then CDs. And then I think it was maybe when I was 16 or maybe 15, I started buying some records. Then I got my dad's old turntable and his old records. And then I got to college and started buying more records. And now I've got a little over like 4,000 records. And I buy all the time. I go out and dig around the Bay Area, or if I'm traveling, or I buy online. And I listen to records all the time. Couple in the morning before going to work. I've got a setup here at work. I'll sometimes go through 10 records at work, and then a couple more spins when I get back home. So average day, maybe anywhere from 8 to 16 records get played. So it's always there. And when I was putting together Private Press, initially I was going to name it Stylus Brewing. And kind of I was really focused on calling it that. Stylus is like the needle, on the
Right.
tune arm of the turntable. But there was a wine that was called Stylus. There was a brewery out of Vegas, I believe, that had a Pilsner named Stylus. They're no longer around. But ultimately, when I worked with Candace Moon to kind of help push my project along and have her do all the filing and keep everything moving and also my trademark work. And she was like, this is going to be difficult. So my backup name was Private Press. And I'm really glad that is how it worked out, that it's now called Private Press Brewing. Private Press is also a music record kind of nod. There's these private press records, which were pressed by people that either were the musicians and were able to save up enough money to press their own records, or someone pressed them for them because they believed in what they were doing. And these records there could have been 50 of them made or 500 of them made. But essentially they were sold out of like car trunks or hardware stores or at shows or just in the local area. And some of them are brilliant and beautiful. Some of them are terrible. They all have this like kind of feeling that like somebody was really putting it all out there. And so those are highly collectible. And they also just have this different zeal to them, which is kind of what I'm doing here
Yeah.
at the brewery now. I'm like privately pressing beers for a really select membership. It's at about 800 members now, but there's no tap room. There's no off-premise accounts. Everything's kind of on-site only for the 6 accounts that I sell beer to, and 95% of it is sold to my members. So it's kind of cool how that all came together without me really even realizing it initially, even when I chose Private Press as like my second name. So yeah, I think I went on a bit of a rant there, but
No, that's great.
Yeah.
So I got a question following up that. Have you, previous to the brewery, were you interested in finding private press records, or has that changed since starting up Private Press Brewing and you go after them more now?
Yeah. I definitely that piques my interest quite a bit more. And it was interesting, even when I had some private press records, but I didn't fully understand the whole culture behind it. And also where they're held within record collectors and kind of that whole world. But then once I named my brewery that, I started becoming more aware of it and realizing that it did have quite a few of them. And there's tons out there. But yeah, if I see private press, lounge jazz from, I don't know, from Kalamazoo, Michigan, I'm from the mid 70s. I'm buying that shit, it's coming home.
Has digging into the world of private press, it sounds, it's really interesting when you talk about it. You talk about kind of the philosophy of the artists and why they would have done the private press, or, what their motivation was. So now that you've dug into kind of that history a little bit, has that philosophy of the private press culture from records influenced your brewery at all?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's being so small now, last year I sold 72 BBLs. Um,
That's
and
amazing.
when I left Jackie O's in 2019, we had done somewhere around like 13 or 13.8 in 2018. That was like I think the number. I might be off a little bit, but um, yeah. So now that I'm like really small and really nimble, and I've got like this kind of like captivated audience, is my membership, which I'm pretty much exclusively making beers for them. Um, and it's not like for them necessarily. They're not like telling me what to make, but that is my audience. And so I feel very fortunate that they understood the beers that I was going to make when they signed up, or at least most of them did. Some of them might have been like, well, I wanted more adjuncts or more sugar or this or that, or like a greater value on the secondary gray market. But for the most part, like I think everybody really understands like what they're going to get, and that's in both just the liquid, but also like the materials that I send out, that in the lab results and the blend notes and like everything that brings it all together. So I do feel like I can just kind of make what I want. So I think that's really grabs a hold of that private press thing. It's like this thing I've been doing and I'm finally getting it out there type of a feeling. And so that's where things like, like Munichwine, or just doing a lot of like stout and barley wine blends. And there's a number of things I've kind of stumbled upon, or not, maybe stumbled's the wrong word, but working by myself in a very quiet space during the pandemic is when it started. I mean, it was June of 2020 is when I sold my memberships. August is when the first beer came out. So it's been very kind of like wood shoppy, insular, and from that, you're just in it. Like you're really in it. I'm not dry hopping anything. I'm not doing yeast management. I'm not trying to turn a tank. I'm just like working with liquid constantly.
Yeah, that's an amazing ability to be able to focus like that. Um, and just go from, like you're saying, all the different disciplines where you have to put on your German brewer hat or your American hoppy beer hat or whatever that may be, and you try to emulate some of those ideas sometimes. And then to always be into one discipline, I always think about making more beer in a way is kind of a furthering of a philosophy of that beer style, if you will. Like the more I pour into the idea of how to make beer in a certain way for a certain kind of beer, then you start discovering more of the mentality or the considerations around it, or different aspects of the brewing process. When you're going, when you've gone into this really focused mode, are there parts of that have really surprised you, that that you've allowed your brain to find within that focus and that constraints, kind of like how, the great serendipitous piece of you being forced to use private press as your name because of those constraints, right? I think there's always great creativity in squeezing something, where you have these constraints. So what do you think you're finding as you work in that kind of focus zone of beer that you're discovering about your barrels or your space, or what you're making in that world?
So yeah, it's being like, all right, it's like stouts, barley wines. That's it. That was very intentional. When I was kind of like restarting like my second brewing life, if you will. And part of that was there's already a lot of breweries here in Santa Cruz. Santa Cruz is a pretty small city within California. It's the smallest county in California. It's a lot bigger than Athens, Ohio, where I came from, but it's still very small. And there's like 15 breweries here now, which is a lot. And there's over 1,000 breweries in the state of California. So one thing that was really clear, like California might not need another IPA. California's making great lager. There's always room for great beer, but it takes a lot to make great beer. A lot of people make good beer or better beer, but it's the accumulation of digging in and finding all the little things, that these little tweaks that happen incrementally so that you can track them and know if they did something good or bad. And over time, and could be years or decades, they add up and then make greatness, right? Or something that sticks and has its moment. So I didn't want to just be another brewery. I didn't want to really take away taproom customers, shelf space, taps, compete. I didn't want to take anything away from anybody, but I also wanted to add something to this community here, or to the greater Bay Area. And part of that was also funding a brewery is really difficult. It takes a lot of money. So I wanted to do something that was more nimble and small, with low overhead. And that was there's no brew house, there's no employees, there's no tap room. And I think I'm just going to make stouts and barley wines because that's what I love making. And everybody does that in California. Pretty much every brewery makes a stout or barley wine. Now they might only do 1 or 6 a year. And I'm going to do 12 to 15, but nobody specializes in it, with the exception, of course, Bottle Logic or Brewery or Moxa, or, there's a dozens that I'm not going to name, but, so if there's a void within here, that's what it is. So that limited everything, but it also made it well, now I get to do what I really love to do.
Right.
Which is can be a curse, maybe we'll see. I love what I'm doing right now, and I hope I can do it for another 10, 15 years or longer. But because you've limited yourself in that respect, no IPA, no lager, everything's going to take 6 months, if not much, much longer. You start looking at, well, what can I do to expand my portfolio? What can I do to add value to this product, whether that's double barreling or blending into a tank and then barreling off that tank to age longer, triple barreling, creating new sub styles, new kind of brew house trickery, if you will, or just being more transparent about the product and telling the product story, not just through an actual written story, but through data or information, or tie in weird jazz fusion nods. What makes it exciting? What moving forward, right? I mean, you have to stay relevant.
I think, from your perspective, the most important thing is keeping yourself excited and moving forward, right?
Yeah, totally. And right now, I think I feel maybe more excited than I did when I started brewing in 2006 when I was 23. I think I'm more amped about it than ever.
That's amazing.
I feel so fortunate to have that outlook on private press and on brewing, because we know, all of our peers, we're all a decade or so into this, you and I, Blake, and or more, and burnout is real, and growth and finding your butt in a office chair instead of in boots on a platform is a better use of your time. But what does that make you feel like? And I've been there. I say that from somebody that has obviously done that. and I do that now. I mean, I sweep the floors. You know, do the
Yeah.
QuickBooks. I unload the semis. Yeah, all that stuff. So, it's kind of fun to go back to what it once was like,
Yeah, it feels like for a while there in the industry, we were kind of like on Van's Warped Tour, where it
totally.
was like they had the same kind of rotating cast.
Yep.
There's a lot of like just crazy energy being poured in, and everyone's feeling it on the consumer side, the producer side. But it became obvious, I think, after a while, to your point of burnout, that that's not sustainable. It's not sustainable as the industry's growing. We're not asking for it to stay this way. We love the growth of the industry, and I think now we're seeing what a more mature industry looks like, where we've got more layers of consumers. It's not just the early adopter super enthusiasts. It's people who want to casually enjoy a great lager or a great barrel aged beer. And that's kind of cool too.
Yep. It's like local, regional, I feel like a lot more. I mean,
yeah,
you're right. It was like the festival circuit was, I mean, I'd see you, 1 week, and then 2-3 weeks later, we'd bump into each other again, and like that went on for years, and then we'd all link up and in like Copenhagen or something, and it was just like, and that's where everybody was, and but now there's a lot less of that. I think we're all getting older too, Blake.
yeah.
It's the other thing.
There's
Like,
good intentionality, I think, behind it now, where
intentionality is a great word, because I've always found you to be like a very intentional person, a very intentional brewer. I remember you did a podcast, I think, with Wagner years ago, maybe 18 or 17, and you were talking about your love of mole and how you were trying to like meld that into a stout, and how you like went to like your favorite mole producer, within the central, I don't know, Georgia area. Now I'm just making stuff up.
You're pretty close. We're actually working on an iteration of that beer right now.
Great. What
because
you like?
it's pepper harvest right now.
Great. That's amazing. You like looked at all the ingredients and really thought about how, if it was a hot side edition or a bright tank edition, or like, I also remember, I think is when I was in Athens brewing with you, which was, did we brew at
your place first?
My place first. So it was after that. That's right. And you were talking about like you were way into Al Pastor, and
I love Mexican food. Yeah.
You're trying to figure out how to like meld spice and pineapple and salt. I think you're trying to make Al Pastor beer.
We did. We actually ended up doing that as a collaboration with Modern Times around that time, where we did like a smoked Berliner with, to get some of that. We're not putting pig in there, so we're gonna have some smoke flavor. Yeah, and the spices. It was a fun thing. Well, thank you.
That's intentionality, right? It's like,
but yeah, I learned that from watching you, Brad.
No, you didn't.
I remember, I'll talk about memories as well. Coming to you taught me a lot, and it makes sense to me perfectly that you're doing what you're doing, because walking through your barrel library at the time, I remember maybe it was in the car on the way there, or as you're unlocking the door, you said, "This is an exploration of oxidation." And I have used that and talking to people I work with, where we have part of our brewery that's so focused on not making oxidized beer. Like, that is the,
which
and you're very important. And you get so into that when we would put barrel aged beers or whatever on our panel, and people was like, "Oh, I'm getting a lot of oxidation." I was like, "Well, yeah, it's been in a barrel for a couple of years. That's what we're doing here, is trying to catch that perfect moment in a window where that oxidation has just taken off enough of the edge and manipulated these raw materials we're working with to create something that's beautiful, but before it's dying. Yeah. And that's just like, so anyway, thank you for that lens, because I don't think I would have so succinctly put it that way before talking to you about that.
Yeah, I like, oxidation is an essential like ingredient for me. It's, you know, how I've always explained it, and it took me a while to kind of get this all together, but like, we're taking a really intense beer styles, putting them into really intense vessels, you know, freshly emptied spirit barrels. And so there's just way too much intensity there. And in order to dull that, to, you know, to stale it down so it's palatable, that takes time. That takes micro-oxygenation. That takes maybe not purging your barrels. I flip-flop on whether I'm going to purge or not. I usually always purge if I'm double barreling, but if I'm racking from primary into barrel, sometimes I don't purge at all. I haven't, and I flip-flop because I haven't found something that said like, no, you have to purge from my palate. But my palate looks for like oxidation. You know, I've got some old stuff in here that's on its third barrel, third year, and at Jackios we had stuff that was encroaching in on 4, almost 5 years. And, you know, like, I like port, I like sherry. What's wrong with like a little bit of that? You know, what's wrong with that? Like that drier, maybe even more acid driven, you know, hang note, if you will. There's just, what I'm finding is there's like so much more to be explored within beer and barrel, primarily from, you know, from me, from the cleaner side, higher ABV side, but without adding hardly any adjuncts or anything. There's still things that we can figure out and crack the code, or like find different combinations of either base beers or yeast or barrels, or, you know, purging or not purging. I find I'm stumbling onto stuff all the time, that kind of like, you know, light off these little things and make me think, well, what if we ran with that a little bit further, you know? And so I don't know. It's
you
fun.
Just mentioned a lot of different pieces there. Do you find, like, are you seeing more variabilities and like focus from yourself right now on process changes or raw material changes, or are they both always at the same time intertwined?
I think it's more process than anything. My raw materials don't change that much. I've got a lot of, you know, I've got like 4 or 5 different stout recipes, and the same with barley wines, and got 4 different Munichwine recipes, and I've got a Vienna wine and a quad, and I'm working on a wheat wine now, and maybe some braggots. But at the core of every one of those recipes, it's all pretty much like Simpsons and Environment or Thomas Fawcett or Dingemans or Muttons. You know, it's like, and maybe some raw, primarily for the stouts, but everything's like European malt, and it's just because it's the best. And so my ingredients don't change too much. It's the process, not even so much on the hot side. There's a couple hot side things that I've been playing around with, but primarily for me, it's like abandoning the whole idea that it's like, we brew this beer, we age it in these barrels for this amount of time, and that's this year's vintage. For me, it's all about like this blended expression, right? And to me, that freedom, like, even if it's a beer that I make every year, it's going to be different every year, because all I'm working with is like a loose construct. Like this is barrel aged stout. So the majority of that blend is going to be single barrel stouts. And there might be some double barrel in there and maybe a porter, which I would call a stout, but
Same,
and
same.
same thing, exactly. It just, for me, it just doesn't have roasted barley, which is like
Yeah.
half the stout recipes.
Yeah.
All the um,
People put
and
roasted barley in stout still?
I do for a few just to create variability, you know. But yeah, and so, but like I'm not aiming for an ABV. If it comes to barley wine, I'm not aiming for a color. You know, I know it's going to smell like a stout, it's going to look like a stout or barley wine or vice versa because that's what's going into it. But what makes the best beer at that moment in time? And me doing my due diligence and blending and knowing my barrel stock and just trying to like, you know, focus in or like triangulate into like that zone and then be like, all right, this is the best I can do right now. You know,
Do
that
you have you
creates.
thought about,
Hmm?
sorry to cut you off. I mean,
No.
it just seemed to me when hearing you talk, there is such an analogous representation of what you're doing and the way you talk about it with beer as to when you go to a jazz night and people are like, hey, do you know the standard? And then, yeah. And really what that means is here's the framework.
Yep.
And then we're going to go riff on that. And they get into it. And then by virtue of who is there and the environment they're in that night and what's happening, it's all going to give you a different version of that jazz standard. But at the end of the day, you will recognize it. Musicians recognize it. Have you, like, is that intentional? Have you made that parallel in your brain with what you're doing, or is that
Yeah.
just
So, you know, I name all my recipes after jazz musicians. So there's drummers, vibraphones, sax, bass, guitar, keys, whatever. Um, so my focus here is on the ensemble. That's what it's all about. So the names of the beers, I want it, it's going to have a tie to the actual beer or the story of the beer, but it's got to sound like a song title or an album title. And then as I list on my, you know, cards that I send with every quarterly order, it says personnel, not recipe. And personnel reflects the recipe that's playing on it. And some of them are like, it's just like two drummers, but there's some ripping, you know, Max Roach and Buddy Guy albums out there. And it's just been like banging on skins and it's outrageous. Or some just by virtue of like what beer got in there, it's like, oh, this is actually like a quartet. It's got drums and bass and keys and like a woodwind or whatever. But that's kind of all happenstance. But ultimately, it comes down to the liquid, and it is like it's about the ensemble. You know, what's going to sound best? What does this want to sound like? And that's what I'm doing when I go out there and start pulling nails and start doing bench top blending. And you know, for me, I'm not thinking about it as like, all right, well, I got to have the saxophone beer and the drum beer. um, it's all completely palate driven. You know, I just got to find, you know, I know what I want, and then I blend towards it. And if there's a beer that goes into it that's like 4 months old, that's like, you know, it's been in a barrel for 4 months, but taste composed, and if that makes the better beer, well, it's going in. You know, I pump kegs into tanks to make a better beer. You know, I don't need draft accounts. Let's make this hit exactly like I want it to. So that's how I look at it. There's loose constructs and there is intention and something that I want. Like the path to get there um, sometimes is really challenging. Other times it just kind of comes together really quickly, just because I know what my stock tastes like or whatever, and but it's just like being in the moment, being in the pocket, if you will,
Oh, I
and
will. Yeah.
just there you go.
Yeah, I love that, that I actually, and I say this with all sincerity, I think it takes that decade of experience to have the humility that you don't have it all figured out or whatever to say that this 4 month beer can go in there. Because I think when you get started off, it's like, oh, we age our barrels for a minimum of a year. I want to be able to tell people and put on the label that there's 12 months or 18 months or whatever, instead of just backing up and saying what's going to make this best. So that's pretty awesome that you're also, to tie it back to what we're talking about at the beginning, that you have that focus, that you're saying, what's going to make it just right. That's incredible.
It like for me, at the end of the day, if you tried to make the best that you could at that moment in time, and you really tried, then like you should be able to put that out. And whether people like it or not, or if you look at Untapped, um, which I do, um, uh, it's okay because you tried. Like you literally could not have made that beer any better at that moment in time. Now maybe you could have like pushed it back another 3 months and revisited it, but there's a point in any business owner's timeline where the bank account's getting really low, and you got to order labels, which don't come as fast as they used to, and you've got to, you got to bring in money. But as time goes on here at Private Press, always try to brew more and more and more, get more barrels filled, so that my libraries or my threads or whatnot, my hues are all more diversified. You know, young, old, different barrels, different recipes, and so I've got this huge palette of color, and doesn't mean I need to use all of it, but hopefully there's something in there that makes it pretty much what I want.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to talk about more of your personnel in just a second. We're going to take a short break for this message and then come right back for more personnel talks with Brad Clark of Private Press.
First Tee is a proud sponsor of the Brewer to Brewer podcast. Some of the brightest brewers across the country have discovered the First Tee advantage. Hill Farmstead, Sweetwater Brewing Company, and Angry Chair are among the many who have used First Tea's unique and quality teas and botanicals to create top-rate beers. First Tee focuses on being direct, flexible, and fast. You can find out more about First Tea's collaboration with brewers and tea ingredients by visiting firstea.com/blog. That's FIRSDTEA.com/blog.
All About Beer is back, and we're asking for your support to help provide the independent beer media this rich and colorful industry deserves. Visit our website, allaboutbeer.com, where we're frequently posting new content. And please consider throwing us a few bucks at patreon.com/allaboutbeer. We have low-cost memberships for individuals and small and large companies alike. Every dollar goes to help produce new articles and podcasts.
Welcome back. I'm here with Brad Clark. Brad, you talked about your threads for a second there and how they're all named after musicians. We've talked about music a little bit, and jazz is certainly something that you keep coming back to. I know I've talked to you about music, and I know jazz is something you're passionate about. Talk to me just a little bit about your journey in that. Growing up, it didn't sound like there was a continual major influence that pushed you in a certain genre direction. Feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but tell me about, what pulled you into the world you listened to and how you got there and how you discovered these people.
Yeah. So let's see here. Like growing up, I'd say like high school years, late middle school, high school, I started playing bass, but I played bass in like a rap metal band. Um, and we had like a turntablist and this is, late 90s, so I'm all about, Rage Against the Machine and Corn and Limp Bizkit and you know, Suicidal Tendencies and System of a Down and a bunch of this stuff. And also like hip hop as well, and Black Sheep and Extra Prolific and Hieroglyphics and a bunch of stuff. But jazz had not really entered the canon at all. And I got into this band called Candiria, which is a New York hardcore band. But they had they had like horns, and they had ambient stuff, and they had kind of hip hop elements in there periodically, but really weird time signatures. And through really getting into them and then reading the liner notes within the CDs, they would like touch on like a guitarist named John Abercrombie, John McLaughlin, another guitarist. And so then I started looking into those, and so like if you start with John McLaughlin, which I named one of my barley wines after, the Mahavishnu recipe. He's in the Mahavishnu Orchestra, which has like these like amazing albums with Billy Cobham on drums, and John Lupani and Jerry Goodman on violin, and Jan Hammer on keys, and it just goes on and on.
Do you remember us talking about Mahavishnu back in the day?
I do.
Oh yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
It's like they just burn. It's just scorched earth.
Yeah.
It's incredible. It's one of the few. So there's like Mahavishnu Orchestra, Weather Report, and Return to Forever. And Weather Report and Return to Forever have great albums, especially the earlier stuff, but they got more electronic and a little bit more commercial. That's when jazz was selling a ton, which was in like the early to mid 70s. Mm-hmm. But I can still go back to all the Mahavishnu albums, and they still rip, they still hold my attention. Whereas some of the other ones, I'm like, oh, this is like memory lane a little bit, and I enjoy it, but I'm looking for something different now. And John McLaughlin played with Miles Davis on In a Silent Way and Bitches Brew, and there's this great story about Herbie Hancock and John McLaughlin talking to each other before one of the in a Silent Way sessions, and it was his first time playing, and Miles told John McLaughlin to play like he doesn't know how to play guitar. And then so that's what he tried to do, because it's Miles Davis. And they left, and he asked Herbie Hancock, like, was that good? And Herbie Hancock said, I don't know, but when the record comes out, it always sounds great. So, that's like direction. But anyways, Candiria got me onto jazz, and then I started listening to jazz, and then I started like hearing all these, sampled drum beats or horn things or loops or keyboard parts from hip hop songs that I knew. And then it just started spiraling. And so primarily I buy like 1968 to 1974, which is really known as like jazz fusion, but it's got electric guitar, electric bass, electric keys, the electric Rhodes, which I named the beer after. And now I'm like so deep into that stuff. I'm buying weird stuff from like all over the world.
Oh, you have to be if you're starting at Mahavishnu, because that's not necessarily mainstream to begin with. Ended up coming across Birds of Fire. Is that the name of the record? I got that on vinyl. It's so funny. I got pulled in similarly, where I was a big 311 fan in high school, being a drummer, and the drummer for them, Chad Sexton,
dramatic genius.
Yes, thank you. He talks about his love for what was his name? Michael Narada Williams,
Okay.
who is the guy who played on Visions of the Emerald Beyond.
Yep.
It's the one like non-Cobham record that they did.
Yep.
And that's what got me on that path as well. So, got a question related to that. When you name uh one of your recipes Mahavishnu, what comes first, the name or the recipe?
That one was a little bit more thoughtful or intentional, if we will. It's like my most like traditional English barley wine, and John McLaughlin is from England, and so that's kind of the tie there. Um, but yeah, it's all SO4 from Saf Vale, and predominantly uh, Maris Otter, but a touch of oats and a little special B, maybe some aromatic or something like that.
So do you find that, like, don't you have like a Dejanette?
Yeah, yeah, that's another barley wine.
Yeah. So
Um,
like Jack Dejanette, I had a Sticks growing up. If you've got like,
the guy's out of control. He's
right. I mean,
so
so
good.
how often are you trying to match a personality of a major jazz musician to the beer? And in what ways do you go through that process of thinking about how those align up?
I mean, Dejanette just plays on like so many albums that I think are just outstanding, and a lot of that has to do with just his like awareness and his ability to not play over top of people, but like, really come out swinging when he needs to. And he's also like a really great keyboard player as well. One of my favorite albums that he plays on is an album by a group called Compost, and it's a self-titled album. Compost, it has like a Incan temple on it, and he doesn't play drums on that album. Bob Moses plays drums on that album. That album is like one of my favorite albums. Uh, I should also, I have Billy Cobham tattooed on my back, um, and George Duke, which is the keyboard player. I do have a beer called Duke. I do not have a beer called Cobham yet, but I did show Billy Cobham my tattoo, and at 80 years old, he said, "Now I've seen it all." Um,
That's the best.
yeah, it was something. But yeah, so like Dejanette's my favorite recipe out of all stouts, barley wines, Munich wines, whatever. Dejanette, I love that recipe. It's loosely a riff on Brick Kiln, which is the barley wine that I worked on for years and years before finally felt comfortable with it at Jackie O's. It's got a touch of chocolate malt in it. And that is my workhorse. I love making barley wine, and Dejanette is always like the real base for most of the barley wines that come out of here, barley wine blends, I should say. So he's kind of like my band leader, in some respects.
I would say, Brad, you are on the Mount Rushmore of barley wine makers in America. I would say your adaptation of the English style into barrels has inspired a lot of people, including myself, on the way to approach making that beer. Um, so want to just give you that. You deserve it. And then related, I've heard wheat wine before you, but Munich wine.
Yep.
I feel like that is squarely in the Brad Clark camp of originals. At what point are you saying that this is not a barley wine and I want to go on a new journey? Like, tell me how you got to Munich wine.
Yeah, so I've always loved Munich malt. I used it a lot in most of my big beers, and even like smaller beers at Jackie O's, primarily the brown ale that we made there. had like a lot of Munich malt in it, and most of the stouts and most of the barley wines did too. So Munich malt's like my favorite. That's like my favorite malt. Um, and then like hearing stories, there's a brewery out of Pennsylvania that I think only operated for a few years, and I think they closed in 2005 or six. They were called Heavyweight. I heard a story about that they had a porter that was like 100%, well, like the base malt was all Munich malt, and that just like blew my mind, my early brewer mind, um, and so I never like went full in on that, but it was always just there. And so here in Santa Cruz, over the past 4 years, I've taken up running, and I go in fits and spurts. Right now, I'm not running that much, but there's a bunch of single track like mountain biking trails right outside of our house, and so I'll go run in the woods by myself without headphones, and in that way, sometimes it's like therapeutic, or I just work through work stuff, or maybe I'm just not there anymore. I'm just looking for rocks and bunnies. But one time I was like really trying to figure out like, okay, I got all these stouts and all these barley wines. What else can I make? How can I like kind of stretch this out a little bit? Because I'm already feeling a little constrained, and I'm trying to make a dozen plus beers a year, and there's got to be some variability across the board. And I was like, well, I could do wheat wine, and I've done that for a long time, but it just didn't seem exciting to me. And then like my mind was like, well, you love Munich malt, Brad. Why not make Munich wine? And it's like, there's wheat wine, rye wine, oat wine. Somebody's probably made rice wine. Somebody probably made Munich wine before I did. They just didn't call it Munich wine. They called it barley wine. This is my barley wine with Munich malt as a base, which is like totally possible. Everything's been done already. We're just reinterpreting it and making it relevant in today's world. That's that. So then I started brewing them, and then I started tasting them at like 3 months, and then some other people started brewing them just because I think I posted about brewing it, and then I got nervous that somebody was going to put out a Munich wine before I did, and then I put out the first batch of Silent Pursuit, which is a nod to this Munich wine kind of pursuit that I did by myself during the pandemic, during the lockdown kind of stages. And so that was just kind of me here in my space, like making Munich wine at the next door brewery, Santa Cruz Mountain Brewing, and or as I called it, the Munich Wine Research Center, which is a Frank Zappa nod to Muffin Man. But anyways, and then it tasted really good, and it tasted really composed early on. So I put out this blend of like 2 different Munich wine recipes. One was like 9 months and one was like 7 months. And then since then, I've woven it into stouts and barley wine, and it's like become like a essential ingredient in a lot of my blends. And so if I'm doing like my like Life is Round, actually that's the name of the Compost album, Life is Round. Going back to Dejanette. When I do Life is Round, which is totally named after the Dejanette album, like it will always have 20% of that will always be Munich wine now, because it works so good. And when I do Silent Pursuit, 20% of that's going to be barley wine. And there's like this balancing act, right? And it brings it brings a nutty note. It brings a different fruit note. I find it's more dark cherry than it is like raisin, brighter stone fruit than you'd find in some other kind of barley wine, especially more like oxidative barley wine. And so, yeah, I just like I said, it's like loose constructs. Like,
what's your oldest Munich wine you've got in stock right now?
I've got two double barrel ones right now that are, I don't know, they're maybe close to 2 years. I don't know. I'd have to look. I don't
Is
keep.
it developing differently than you expected?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely like softening and becoming a little fuller bodied, and higher in like higher alcohol. So that fuller body sometimes quickly like dissipates and leaves your tongue pretty dry.
Mhm.
So I'm just monitoring it right now. I think I'm going to do a double barrel version of Silent Pursuit soon. Uh, and I've got two barrels that will be the anchor for that. And I just need to find one more. Or also, what I've been doing is, if I need three barrels for like to fill the club, like what they may buy. But if I can't get the complexity I want, I'll bring in a fourth barrel or maybe even a fifth, then blend all those together and then get new barrels and then rack out 100 gallons and then
Mhm.
age that. So I've got blends aging, now as well that I can use as, what I start my blend with or what really takes a blend to the next level, or maybe it's a single barrel release, but it's kind of
Right.
free. Yeah.
Put it on a journey and see what happens to it.
Yeah. Why not? Right.
Yeah,
That's what we're here to
absolutely.
do. Figure shit out. Right. Make.
Yeah, related to that, like what is your frontier right now that you're thinking about? Like where, as we talked about, you're discovering new things, new pieces of that. Where are you finding a source of creativity, curiosity? Like what's your current passion or
Let's see.
thought, I should say?
Yeah, a couple things I got going on. I've got some like new oak barrels, heavy toast coming.
Hmm.
So I've never played with that. Always wanted to. Kind of going back to the Odell Woodcut series,
Hmm.
an old sleeper back in the day. But I remember visiting Odell after JBF one year, and Joe, I can't remember his last name. He left and started a brewery in Austin at some point, but he gave us an incredible tour, and we tasted all these virgin oak barrels, and they were really dynamic. And now with this process that I have here, I think having some virgin oak in here that I can blend into something could be really dynamic. So I'm excited about that. Um, I've been doing mash capping with different things. Um, so kind of like taking a nod from our old like black IPA techniques where we would,
Mm.
cap the mash with black malt and then
Yep.
sparge. So I'm doing that with like cacao nibs and toasted coconut, um, different things just to see if like what you can, if you can build like a more composed chocolate character by adding nibs in the mash, but then you boil it for a while and then age it for a year. And it's arguable, but it's something different and it's fun. So I'm doing it. Um, what else? I want to do more triple barreling. I've been getting a lot of barrels that have head bungs,
Oh yeah.
and
How do you like that? I've always hated
um,
it.
uh, it's difficult to work with. Especially some of the ones I've been getting have like bigger bung holes. So it
Oh
took me a
yeah.
while to find like a bung that would fit that. And now I'm really concerned that when I want to get it out, my racketeer won't fill that space. It won't be able to push it through. So I think I should get a flex impeller pump to just move it out, which is fine. I used to do that. Um, but they're difficult to work with. But I was talking to Tim, the head brewer or owner of Cellar Maker, co-owner of Cellar Maker, and he made a great point that like you might be getting a lot more oak from the vertical barrel because When they're on their side, you're missing these staves. As they evaporate, you're missing all the stave. But if they're vertical, you're getting a lot more stave, which has the majority of the char. But as I'm talking about this right now with you, Blake, I'm realizing you might also be missing the head of the barrel if it's vertical.
Yeah,
Which
imagine
might
there's a shift, right? Where
something.
you've as it starts evaporating from the top, your drop off of oak content is much quicker, and you're probably going to have oxidation faster, right? Because there's more area
Typically,
up there.
I do try to top those off frequently, and
Oh.
before I move them, I put wet rags on top of them overnight, and that swells the head. But yeah, but I'm playing around with those. There's this like smaller bourbon producer, kind of based out of San Francisco, called Subtle Spirits,
Mhm.
and he's not producing bourbon, but he's purchasing barrels or doing barrel selections from MGP and putting out some like really dynamic blends and some great single barrels. And I've been getting all of his barrels for the past 6 or 8 months, and a lot of those are the vertical ones. But Joshua Tynes is at Subtle Spirits is putting out some cool stuff, and it's kind of regional. So the fact that I've been able to grab a lot of those barrels is really kind of like, we'll see where that takes Private Press next year, or even within this year. But so that's been another thing. I guess that's
Yeah. No, that's pretty cool. I think that's something that I've always, I think, learned a lot by talking to yourself or other folks, is that, at Creature Comforts, one thing I do like about our approach to beers, we make a lot of different kinds of beer. We try to execute on everything from barrel aged to, approachable lagers, things like that. And it's fun to be able to try all that, but it's also, there's that element of, jack of all trades, master of none kind of thing, where I recognize there's a trade-off of talking to other folks who have like a supremely focused discipline on what they're looking at. And it's always interesting to, see how those parallel out and to talk to someone about the things they're uncovering within that focus.
Yeah, definitely like deep diving. And it's just, yeah, there's there's not many distractions anymore. And like my life for the most part is, I come to work for a little bit, I do what I need to do, and then I go home and I hang out with my dog, and Derek comes home after work, and we make dinner and watch TV, and then and then I go back to work the next day for like, sometimes it's 3 hours, sometimes it's 8, rarely more than 8. So there's a really different focus, a different appreciation. One of the things that my main goal is to sustain the quality of life that I have right now. And so if I look at that from Private Press, it's about keeping the quality of the product really high, staying relevant, keeping people purchasing and wanting to be a part of the Private Press, experience. And then hopefully that allows me to spend more time at home. I love working, but the success of this business is based upon the amount of time I spend outside of it, not the bank account.
It's a great way to look at it. I think
it's been life-changing. I mean, big time. Yeah.
There's a lot of people who need to hear that.
Yeah. That's why I like to talk about it, because it's really important. But it takes a while to find it, and
so
it takes a lot of restraint to not screw it up.
to have some balance here, what are some things that you do miss about maybe, working with other people or being in a different brewery environment.
Yeah, team. I miss a team. Like, it was awesome. Yeah. Having a bunch of people that really cared about what they're doing, and like this central driving force that isn't just you. And it was, you could pass the ball off, take a break, and know that it was still moving forward with, just as much vigor. So I do really miss brewing with people, which is why not having a brew house really helps me, because whenever I go to Faction or Santa Cruz Mountain to brew, I get to work with their staff. I'm on the brew deck and running most of the brew every single time, but I do it so periodically. Like I haven't brewed in almost 4 months, that I forget how to do it, or I'm like, well, where does this valve need to be during pour off, so that I don't stick it,
Yeah.
and like all these things, and they're always there to help. And then we have beers and hang out and share stuff and talk and catch up, and yeah, that's what I miss the most. I mean, sometimes this gets kind of lonely. I've got 6,500 square feet, and I make 72 BBLs, and nobody's come in here today. I thought a delivery driver was going to deliver some barrels, but I don't think he's coming. So literally nobody's checking in on me. And
Yeah.
so yeah, I definitely miss that like team component. Yeah, I also miss like a tap room. I miss like this space that says like, this is what you do, or like people walk in, they're like, oh, like, let's see what they're all about, and like being able to interact with customers. And so I get to do that during like pickups, which is quarterly here. But and I see a lot of my members out and about in Santa Cruz, or like if I go up to San Francisco or Oakland or whatnot, I bump into my members all the time. But I miss being able to just walk through a door and to be able to interact with people.
Absolutely. So I don't want to end on a downer, so I'm gonna one last question for you. What does bring you the most joy now?
Leaving work and going home and drinking a Pilsner with my dog outside. Hands down. It's the best.
What's your dog's name?
Sitting outside in Santa Cruz with like a Sante Darius West Coast or lager. It doesn't have to, it could be not that great of a ball day or not that great of a beer, but it's the best. Yeah, it's the best.
Good living in Santa Cruz.
Right.
I love that. Well, man, thanks for chatting with me.
Yeah, thank you so much, Blake. This has been great. I wish I could like flip it around and then do the same thing to you, but I'm not prepared to do that.
I had the same feeling when
and Avery already did that.
Yeah, when she interviewed me, I was the same way. I was like, well, I want to interview you now, but it didn't work. Here we go. You get to pass the baton.
Yeah.
Well, thanks, man. Hopefully I get to see you soon.
Yeah, I hope so too. I don't do a lot of festivals anymore, so I like drinking beer in my backyard with my dog.
Dude, sign me up. I need to come visit. That'd be great.
Yeah, you should. Yeah.
All right, I'll come out there.
Like, yeah, and I think I should be maybe interviewing Corey King if you would respond to his emails.
Well, now it's out there in the ether. It's got to happen. So Brad will be back on the next episode of this show as the host, having a conversation with a brewer of his choosing. Maybe Corey, maybe not. That will be on air in 2 weeks. So make sure you tune in for that. Visit allaboutbeer.com and follow on social media. And to support journalism in the beer space, check out patreon.com/allaboutbeer. I'm Blake Tyers of Creature Comforts Brewing. Thank you for listening to the Brewer to Brewer podcast.
First Tee is a proud sponsor of the Brewer to Brewer podcast. Some of the brightest brewers across the country have discovered the First Tee advantage. Hill Farmstead, Sweetwater Brewing Company, and Angry Chair are among the many who have used First Tea's unique and quality teas and botanicals to create top-rate beers. First Tee focuses on being direct, flexible, and fast. You can find out more about First Tea's collaboration with brewers and tea ingredients by visiting firsttee.com/blog. That's FIRSDTEA.com/blog.